This is a continuation of Lab 6. We're now looking at the vertebrae and the vertebral column. Your vertebrae, we have three different types of vertebrae. You have your thoracic vertebrae, which is in your mid-back region, your cervical, which will be near your neck, and the lumbar, which is lower back. We're going to use the thoracic for the generic terms of the vertebrae. Okay, on the handout, it goes through the basic names. Now, the names apply to all three of these, but we're just going to use this one. We have the body, which is this big, thick block of bone, which was where it will sit. And then you have a number of processes coming off the bone. So in the back, we have the spinous process, and it's going to sit like this. Here's your spinous process. This is the bump you can feel when you run your hand down your back. And then we have two processes on either side, transverse processes. Transverse means to the side. Okay. We have a hole, the vertebral foramen. Now this is the hole where your spinal cord is going to run, okay, the whole length. And underneath the vertebrae, we have a notch, and this is called the inferior vertebral notch. Okay? And they'll stack one on top of each other. Now, when they stack, we have these superior processes, articulating processes right here. This is where one vertebrae will hit the vertebrae above it. And then underneath the notch, we have two more processes, which will allow, they're right here, in the inferior notch, which will allow this vertebrae to contact with the vertebrae below it. Okay? So you have three different vertebrae to look at. We have a cervical vertebrae in your neck. Now, they have the same structures, but they're going to point out the differences so that you can identify it. Because if I put out just one vertebrae or a picture of vertebrae, I want you to be able to identify that and name that vertebrae. The difference between your cervical and the other ones is that it also has a set of holes. Besides the vertebral foramen, it has holes on the side, and these are called transverse foramen. These are for blood vessels to run up to the neck. The other two vertebrae do not have that. Also, the spinous process is bifurcated, forked, right here. The other two do not have that. Okay? So that's your cervical. Your thoracic, some people say it looks like a giraffe. If you want to remember it that way, that's fine, as long as you name it properly. I think that the body looks kind of heart-shaped, and your thoracic cavity is where your heart is located. And then the lumbar is a kind of a big, heavy, very large, clunky vertebrae, because now it's holding up the whole body. Okay? You got a very big body of the vertebrae. Okay? It's very stumpy looking, very short, the processes. I think it kind of looks like Fred Flintstone. Some people say Fred Flintstone vertebrae because it's so short and stubby. Some people say it looks like a moose. Again, if you want to remember the moose, that's fine, as long as you give me the proper name. Okay? Now we have those three vertebrae. Then we have a special pair of vertebrae, and these are the first and second cervical vertebrae. The first cervical vertebrae, C1, is named atlas, and C2 is named axis. This is the one on the bottom. Now the axis has a structure sticking up that looks tooth-like. It is called the dens. It will go into a hole on the atlas. There's usually a ligament here in front, and that hole will hold the tooth structure in there, the dens there, and that is called the fovea dentis, hole for tooth. And this is going to allow your head to rotate back and forth and up and down. At the very bottom of the vertebrae column is the sacrum. Now and then we have the coccyx. Now with the vertebrae, we have different numbers. With your cervical vertebrae, you have 7. Think of breakfast, that's 7. Your thoracic vertebrae, you have 12. That's when you have lunch. And your lumbar, you have 5 vertebrae. Okay, so 7, 12, and 5 for the three different ones as you move down. Your sacrum is fused from 5 different vertebrae, and your coccyx is fused from 3 to 5 vertebrae. Okay, and they contain that structure. All right, that's it for the vertebral column, but I want to talk a little bit more about your thoracic cavity and the thoracic cage. Your thoracic cage is going to be made up of your sternum, okay, and the ribs that go and attach to the sternum and go back and hit on the vertebrae. All right, with your sternum has 3 parts. This is the bone right in the middle of your chest. The top of it is called the manubrium. Then we have the body, And then at the very end, this little pointy process is called the xiphoid process. Attached to the sternum are costal cartilages, which will then attach to the rib. The rib will be attached to the cartilage. Now we have 12 pairs of ribs. You can see by if you counted through this, you wouldn't come up with 12 though. The first 7 are called true ribs because they have a direct connection, one rib connecting alone to the sternum. When you get down here to these 3, which is 8, 9, and 10, they share a connection. So these are considered false ribs. And then we have 2 small ribs that do not touch the sternum at all, and those are called floating ribs. Here's your rib. The rib, you need to know 3 parts of the rib. The majority of the rib is called the rib shaft. When it gets closer to this area, it has a bump, and the bump is called the tubercle. And then we have the head of the rib, where it touches the vertebrae. So you've got those 3 parts, the head, the bump, and the shaft. Okay. The last thing about your skeletal system is that of the skull of an infant. Now, with the infants, when you are first born, you have a number of these bones that are not in the cranium that are not fused yet. They don't fuse until about age of 5 completely. So it leaves openings which is just covered by a little dense membrane. This is called a fontanelle. We have a very nice anterior fontanelle, which is going to be where the frontal bones come to hit the parietal bones. Okay. We have a small posterior fontanelle where the parietals touch the occipital. This will close very soon after birth, the posterior, but the anterior will stay open until a year and a half or thereabouts. It's called the soft spot on new babies. Also on the skull of the newborn or fetus, you see that the frontal bone, which we think is one bone, is actually made up of 2 bones. And this frontal bone has a thin area where it attaches, but you do not see that after birth, and it is completely solid one bone. This is called a metatopic suture because it disappears and you don't see it in the adult skeleton. Okay.